Distinguished speakers, dear participants, good afternoon and good morning. On behalf of the UNESCO World Water Assessment Program, I would like to welcome you to the session on the United Nations World Water Development Report in 2022. The report is published by UNESCO on behalf of UN-Water, and its production is coordinated by the UNESCO World Water Assessment Program. The report gives insight on main trends concerning the state, use, and management of fresh water and sanitation, based on work done by the members and partners of UN-Water. I would like to express gratitude to the government of Italy, as it is their financial support which makes this flagship report possible. 2022 edition focuses on groundwater. This invisible resource constitutes approximately 98% of liquid fresh water on our planet. With the increasing impact of climate change on availability and spatial distribution of surface water, groundwater is becoming our most important resource for adaptation. Before starting our session, I would like to encourage the audience to use the chat to pose questions, comments, and also links that can interest the participants. I would also like to introduce my colleague, Mr. Engin Kongako, the WWDR process coordinator, who has organized this session and will assist the speakers also as timekeeper, very important function. To this regard, I remind the distinguished speakers to remain into the 5 minutes assigned. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Ambo, who is the chair of UN-Water and the president of IFAD. Mr. Ambo was not able to join us, but he sent a short video message. Let's listen to its words. Thank you.
Michele, audio is not on. If you could please restart the video with the audio on. Thanks.
I would like to warmly welcome you all to this session at Stockholm World Water Week. I would also like to thank colleagues at UNESCO who published the UN World Water Development Report on behalf of UN-Water and coordinate its productions by the UNESCO World Water Assessment Program. This year, the report is focused on a crucial issue that has been widely overlooked for many years. I mean, groundwater. Groundwater is our biggest source of liquid fresh water, and yet its importance is almost invisible. Around the world, this hidden treasure is poorly understood and greatly undervalued. As the report sets out, groundwater sustains our drinking water supplies, our sanitation systems, farms, industries, and ecosystems. In the driest regions, it's often the only water people have. But all too often, it is being overused, polluted, and neglected. Dear colleagues, groundwater will become more and more important as we respond to the challenges of climate change and a growing population. Today's discussions will explore how to protect and optimize the use of groundwater while balancing the needs of people and nature. For too long, it has seemed that groundwater is out of sight and therefore out of mind. As demand for water rises, there is an urgent need for policymakers to understand groundwater's critical role and better manage the competing demands of water and sanitation systems, agriculture, industry, ecosystems, and climate change adaptation. We must thoroughly explore and monitor groundwater resources so that we can use it sustainably and equitably. Dear friends, I would like to pay tribute to UNESCO and IGRAC, the International Groundwater Resources Assessment Center, for coordinating the UN Water Task Forces on two powerful campaigns around World Water Day and the forthcoming World Toilet Day. I would also like to express my gratitude to UNESCO for hosting the upcoming UN Water Summit on groundwater in Paris in December. As we build up to the UN 2023 Water Conference in March, it is our duty to ensure groundwater has its rightful place in all of our action plans. Let us take the findings of the 2022 UN World Water Development Report and make the invisible issue of groundwater visible to all. I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much to UN Water Chair for the points that he made. And now, just before entering the core of the session, we would like to show you a short video that WAPA produced based on the main finding of the report. This will allow a smooth transition to the thematic presentation on settlement, food security, environment, and climate change. Please, let's go with the video. Invisible, visible. Beautiful video. Okay, dear participants, the 2022 edition of the WWDR is composed of 14 chapters to cover issues that are relevant to groundwater across the wide spectrum, starting from legal and institutional aspects, groundwater use in major sectors, the link between groundwater and ecosystems, key role of groundwater in adapting to climate change, the knowledge base on its valuable resource, policy, planning, and management aspect, transboundary dimension, financing, and finally, regional perspectives. Today, due to time limitation, we have selected for you the finding of 4 specific chapters. The first is about environment, and particularly because we have our speaker, Mr. Pedro Arroyo, who is the UN Special Envoy for Water and Sanitation, that is with us only for a limited time. He is traveling, and thank you very much, Pedro, that you can make it. So it is about environment, and specifically on groundwater dependent ecosystem. Indeed, an important issue that is often overlooked is the fact that the ecology of aquatic environments and their surroundings are dependent on the interactions between groundwater and surface. Groundwater dependent aquatic ecosystem can be found across a variety of landscapes, ranging from valleys to high mountains, to the bottom of the oceans, and even in deserts. So I give the floor to Mr. Pedro Arroyo to expand on the link between groundwater and the ecosystem and the service they provide, which are numerous and wide-ranging benefits to humans. Pedro, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It was a great honor for me to participate in the elaboration of the report we are talking about, and it is indeed a great honor to participate in this event. Thank you so much. As is well known, every year UN Water proposes, as you said, a water management theme to reflect on, which forms the content of the United Nations World Water Development Report. As you know, in 2022, the report coordinated by UNESCO was and is entitled Groundwater, Making the Invisible Resource Visible. In my work as Special Rapporteur on the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation, the topic in question seems to me to be of the utmost importance and significance, especially in the current climate change perspectives. Underground aquifers are, on the one hand, the water lungs that sustain life on islands and continents. But on the other hand, they are also the part of the iceberg that, although unseen, store and manage 20 times more fresh water than we see on the surface in rivers, lakes, and wetlands. Aquifers are the great water flow regulating reservoirs on islands and continents that supply the base flow of rivers and aquatic ecosystems when it doesn't rain. At the same time, they collect and store the water that infiltrates the soil when it rains. In this way, aquifers act as I said, the lungs of water cycle on islands and continents. This natural flow regulation function, essential for sustaining continental biodiversity, multiplies the importance and value of aquifers in the current climate change outlook, insofar as the risks to be prevented derive to a large extent from the increase in rainfall variability, with all that this entails in terms of risks of drought, flooding, and inundation. As is well known, a large part of the risks generated by climate change lie in extreme events, both drought and heavy rainfall, with the consequent river flooding and flood risk. In the face of these risks, it is essential to promote adaptation strategies to increase both social and environmental resilience. Specifically, strengthening environmental resilience in the face of droughts and floods involves recovering the environmental functions of wetlands and aquifers in particular, as they are the most inertial parts of the hydrological cycle on islands and continents. From this perspective, aquifers become key elements in drought strategies, which will tend to worsen in intensity, frequency, and timing. Beyond being the water lungs of nature, as I said, aquifers can and should be strategic reserves for managing extraordinary droughts, which require radical changes to put an end to the overexploitation processes that affect aquifers, on which particularly vulnerable areas depend. In Spanish, there is a motto that says, ojos que no ven, corazón que no siente. That is, eyes that don't see, heart that doesn't feel, and I add, y cabeza que no piensa, that is, and head that doesn't think. For these reasons, among others, the recommendations of this report on groundwater making the invisible resource visible need to be urgently addressed and followed up. I hope that the March 2023 Water Conference in New York and the Social Forum on Water organized in Geneva 3 and 4 November by the Human Rights Council in preparation of the New York conference will give this report the space it deserves, giving it the dimension need from a human rights perspective in terms of guaranteeing drinking water and sanitation to the most impoverished in the harsh expected climate change scenarios. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for your very comprehensive contribution, and thank you for joining us. Okay, let's follow on and talk about the groundwater and settlement. Since early times, civilizations tapped into subterranean sources to meet their need for good quality water. Throughout the history, the groundwater dependence of cities has kept growing. In 2020, nearly 50% of the global urban population are believed to be supplied from groundwater sources. For example, in the European Union alone, groundwater provides the public water supply for 310 million people. In the US, similarly, almost 1/3 of the population get their water from aquifers. I would like to give the floor to Piero Otieno from Habitat, who will present the major findings of the chapter on settlement. Piero, the floor is yours, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I think you have done a good job summarizing the chapter itself. So thank you very much. The chapter 4 of the World Water Development Report is on groundwater for human settlements. UN Habitat has co-authored this chapter with the Groundwater Group at the International Water Association, together with the Rural Water Supply Network and IAH. The chapter gives an overview of groundwater supply for domestic use, including drinking water in both urban and rural settings. It gives a number of recommendations on how to sustainably manage groundwater in human settlements, mainly because of threats of pollution as a result of inadequate rural and urban sanitation. It also recognizes the fact that private urban self-supply for groundwater has markedly increased in developing country cities over time. So let's start with this first slide. This slide recognizes high dependence on groundwater for both public and private supply, and the fact that nearly 50% of the global urban population today is estimated to be supplied from groundwater resources. Next. The next slide also takes note of the fact that the use of private water wells for urban self-supply has proliferated in recent years. The practice usually commences as a coping strategy in the face of irregular or inadequate piped water supply, but then it continues in perpetuity as a cost reduction measure in a number of human settlements. Nevertheless, private groundwater use tends to pass under the radar of official in-country water supply statistics, or the phenomenon is not being recognized by a number of governments. Next. The other typical trend is in the evolution of urban water supply is the decisions that cities are left with either to go for external water wells because of inadequacy in supply in the number of water wells within the city limits, or a decision to import water from a long distance outside the city limits. So there is often not enough groundwater available within the city limits to meet the needs of domestic use. Next. In a number of human settlements, typically in the rural settlements, groundwater remains the only feasible and affordable way to extend basic water access to the unserved rural population in much of the world. Next. So the next chapter, the next slide is on the impact of urbanization on groundwater. And this is a very critical discussion that cities must have. One is the fact that there is absolute resource constraint in the case of larger cities. So a number of larger cities are already experiencing inadequacy of supply from groundwater within their limits. The next challenge is the frequent quality degradation of groundwater as a result of in situ sanitation, leaky storage of hydrocarbon fuels, casual disposal of industrial and municipal effluents, and uncontrolled solid waste dumps within the human settlements. The other one is the tendency to overexploit groundwater resources within the urban areas where the water utility is a major obstructor, which can be accompanied by challenges of land subsidence impacting urban infrastructure and saline water intrusion. And lastly, the problem of elevated levels of natural trace contaminants within the groundwater itself. So the problem of arsenic and fluoride in groundwater locally sometimes is a big problem in South Asia and also in East Africa. The last slide is on the recommended actions to sustainably manage groundwater. So let's go to the next slide, and that is my last slide. So there is a problem of systematic, the action is around systematic urban groundwater studies that need to become a routine element of urban planning at a detailed scale. As it is now, the two sectors of urban development and water are not coordinating enough. And we need to make sure that planning forward, urban planning needs to take cognizance of the need to do or undertake systematic urban groundwater studies. The next one is the need for protecting critical water well or springhead resources. And this is mainly the responsibility of water service providers, water utilities. A lot of emphasis needs to be put on the protection of the source of groundwater. And the next one is the need for full interaction on and monitoring of urban groundwater between a number of stakeholders. So a number of stakeholders, including water utilities, including local governments, including research institutions, need to work together to ensure that there is a full stakeholder engagement and monitoring of urban groundwater. And lastly, we need to establish stable long-term collaboration frameworks between urban water utilities and local academic research centers. So I thank the partners of UN Habitat who coordinated the publication of this chapter, and we look forward to feedback from participants. Thank you. You're muted, Michaela, you're muted.
Okay, I wanted to say, Pierre, thank you very much for this very clear presentation, for your sketch. The slides were very clear. And also thank you for mentioning the urbanization impact on groundwater, which is really crucial. So thank you very much. And we go to the third presentation. I don't know, Engin, how we are with the time, if we are good. But in any case, the third presentation is about groundwater, aquifers, and climate change. Climate change strongly influences freshwater supply and demand. Warming of approximately 1 degree centigrade over the last half century has directly impacted the supply of freshwater through more pronounced extremes in terms of precipitation, floods, and droughts. As groundwater accounts approximately 98% of all liquid freshwater on Earth and is more protected than surface water against climatic effects, it is then our most precious resource to enable society to adapt to intermittent and sustained water shortages caused by climatic variability. On the other hand, talking about mitigation, heat stored in deeper aquifers can contribute to climate change mitigation by producing renewable, the geothermal energy, and reducing in this way the CO2 emissions. I would like to give the floor at this stage to Professor Steve Ger from IHE Delft in the Netherlands. He will talk about the latest understanding of the impacts of climate change on groundwater and the role of groundwater in adapting to climate change. Tibor, you have 5 minutes. I know it is challenging. We'll be listening to you with great interest.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I hope you can all see the screen. I would like to acknowledge Richard Taylor, who was the lead of this chapter, and I would also like to acknowledge UNESCO IHP and IIH and all the contributing authors. So in this chapter, what we did was we started with an overview of the climate change impacts on the groundwater resources. Then we looked at resilience and vulnerability of the different aquifer systems under climate change. And finally, of course, we went into adaptations to climate change and the role of groundwater in climate change mitigation. And we did so in a way that we had to understand the relationship between climate change and groundwater systems that is very different from that between climate change and surface water. Think of the high flow times, recharge that occurs over decades and even centuries. So very different, but at the same time, groundwater and surface water systems are clearly interlinked in many cases. So these impacts will also be interlinked. So what we found in terms of the climate change impacts in terms of groundwater recharge or replenishment, these are largely associated to changes in precipitation patterns, also shown on this map towards the end of the century. We see a substantial reduction of rainfall in certain hotspot areas where there's consensus among climate models. These are the orange and red areas on the map. And we also see there's also consensus around the intensification of rainfall. And this, interestingly enough, provides chances of a higher recharge, as shown by evidence from the tropics, Australia and USA, because heavy rainfall has been seen to strongly contribute to enhancing the percolation and therefore the recharge of systems. However, in other areas, there is, of course, also the risk of increased flooding, and including groundwater flooding, in particular in temperate regions. Of course, more frequent droughts called and had a need for storage and the important role that groundwater can play there. And yes, there is still uncertainty in global projections on the impacts on recharge because of that complex interaction between topography, climate, geology, and land use, which calls, of course, for further and more local studies that try to understand these interactions. Sea level rise, of course, considered in coastal areas and deltas as very problematic. It contributes to seawater intrusion through the inland shifting of the fresh saltwater interface. But at the same time, it also increases the impacts from seawater inundations that occur during storm surges and cyclones, which we also expect to be more frequent. However, we cannot forget that groundwater obstructions themselves are actually the main cause of seawater intrusion through drawdown and, of course, land subsidence, as mentioned by the previous presenter. And the extent of seawater intrusion will depend on other factors, again, such as coastal topography, geology, and replenishment of freshwater. Besides salinization, we can have other impacts on groundwater quality. And one that we are particularly concerned about is the high rainfall intensity that can amplify recharge and mobilize both traditional and emerging contaminants under agricultural land or in urban areas with inadequate sanitation. On the other hand, if you have a reduction in recharge, that can lead to evapotranspiration in warmer areas, which could increase, there's evidence for that, chloride, nitrate, and arsenic in groundwater. So if we look at these impacts, we can also look at vulnerable and more resilient aquifer systems. Typically, we see also a graph of the different impacts, and coastal and deltaic aquifer systems, such as the Asian megadeltas, island states, they're the most vulnerable, but also rapidly expanding low-income cities because of contamination and risk of leaching are quite vulnerable. And of course, low storage and low recharge aquifer systems in drylands are equally vulnerable. More resilient, of course, these systems that comprise thick, extensive sedimentary sequences, although this is context specific, so it depends on how much groundwater exploitation is going on at the moment and in the future. And if we look at what we call fossil groundwater, very old groundwater in areas without recharge, of course, we can consider the abstraction in a way climate resilient, but it will be fully controlled by the available storage. Now, looking at the last three slides into solutions and human responses, of course, we would like to benefit more and more from the capacity of aquifer systems to store water surpluses and to reduce evaporative losses as opposed to surface water systems. And their managed aquifer recharge is showing a tremendous potential and increasing rapidly, although there are, of course, concerns and still many challenges in terms of uptake in policies, as well as upscaling in terms of space and resources needed. We should continue to utilize distributed groundwater storage where that is currently not being done in conjunctive use with surface water, because there are many systems where groundwater is currently flowing away without being used, so under exploitation. And finally, of course, improving community hygiene and sanitation will reduce the risk of contamination and enhance resilience in that aspect. And you see a number of examples of managed aquifer recharge on this slide. And the last two slides are linked to mitigation. One is more linked to energy in the way that groundwater can be used. It's not used that much yet, but should be increasingly used for low carbon electricity generation. But what is becoming more and more popular is the use of groundwater for heating and cooling. And there are the different systems shown here that we'll not go into, but there's a large potential and a growing interest, although we do need to consider the environmental impacts. And finally, that of carbon capture and sequestration, that is, of course, used to curb accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that is particularly linked to point sources. Very interesting, but it is region specific, it is still costly, and it will require government subsidies to further promote projects such as the ones occurring currently in the North Sea and in Canada. And with this, I would like to end this presentation, and I thank you for the floor and for the invitation.
Thank you, Tibor. Thank you very much, and thank you for. I know that this topic, groundwater and climate change, can take a standalone session, but you succeed to highlight the major issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now the last presentation of this part of the session, which is on groundwater and agriculture. Since 1970s, groundwater has played a major role in accelerating food production, particularly in semi-arid and arid areas with limited precipitation and surface water. Food production via groundwater has also sustained local and regional economies while boosting livelihoods, economic growth, and food security. However, we still have the big challenge lying ahead of us. We need to increase food, feed, and biofuel production around 50% relative to 2012 levels in order to meet the global water and agricultural demands by 2050. For this reason, increasing agricultural productivity through the sustainable intensification of groundwater abstraction is a major challenge. In the process, decreasing water and environmental footprints of agricultural production are parallel priorities. And Mr. Jipper Hugenven, Senior Land and Water Officer of FAO, will present us these points and more in his presentation. Jipper, very nice to see you again, our neighbor. The floor is yours. And thank you very much for keeping the time.
Okay, thank you very much, Michaela. So yes, let's shift now the focus to water and agriculture, and I would like to start with some figures. Globally, the groundwater withdrawals add up to close to 1,000 cubic kilometers per year. So this figure includes all sectors. So apart from agriculture, also water for domestic use and water used in industry. However, globally, 70% of all groundwater withdrawals are used for agricultural production. And even more in the drier, arid and semi-arid regions. Most of this water is used for irrigation, but groundwater is also very important for drinking water for livestock. It's estimated that globally already 38% of all areas equipped for irrigation use groundwater, but they use it often in combination with surface water. The areas where this happens the most is in North Africa, North America and Asia, and the countries with the largest area under irrigation from groundwater include India, China, the USA, and Pakistan. Groundwater has been very important for the agricultural sector, it has been playing a major role in accelerating food production since the 1970s. The use of groundwater is often preferred by farmers over the use of surface water. Because it is a more reliable source of water, and farmers often have much more control over it. The conjunctive use of groundwater and surface water in agriculture is significant. In many large-scale irrigation projects, which are often fed mainly by surface waters, farmers drill often wells to get additional groundwater to have more control in irrigating their crops. The water productivity, which can be measured as the amount of water the amount of crop yield per unit of water applied is generally also higher than the water productivity of surface water. This again has to do with the fact that farmers generally have more control over the water supply when the water comes from groundwater rather than surface water. In the livestock sector, groundwater is often used for drinking water for the animals, but in terms of volumes, it's very small as compared to the amount of water that is being used to irrigate fodder crops. So until now, I've presented mainly the contribution of groundwater use to the agricultural sectors, but there are of course also very many negative externalities. First of all, we can look at the use of water from shallow aquifers. The use of groundwater from shallow aquifers has the advantage that water is continuously available and the pumping costs are low. However, where shallow groundwater is being used, often waterlogging is taking place and salinization of the soils and the groundwater is also occurring. Another negative effect of agriculture on groundwater is the pollution. Agriculture as a sector has overtaken contamination from settlements and industry as the major factor in the degradation of groundwater and surface water. Pollution comes from nutrients, pesticides, salts, sediments, organic carbon, pathogens, metal and drug residues. Nitrate is the most occurring contaminant due to agriculture in groundwater globally. The global environmental and social costs of surface and groundwater pollution are due to agriculture are estimated to exceed billions of dollars annually. One of the latest trends in irrigated agriculture is the use of solar pumps to pump groundwater for irrigation. This has, of course, an important benefit as it is clean energy, as a clean energy source, and once installed, energy is also for free. So that's nice for the farmers, but it also carries a risk because free energy does not provide an incentive for farmers to use water sparingly. And this may result in overpumping and declining groundwater water levels. So careful use of solar powered irrigation systems is needed. And with this, I would like to conclude my presentation. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I would like to thank my colleagues Matthew England and Virginie Gier for their contribution to this chapter of the World Water Development Report and this presentation. Many thanks. Over to you, Michela.
Okay, thank you, thank you, Chip. You're right. Agriculture is really the elephant in the room when we talk about groundwater. So thank you to showing your short slides of PPT, a very well balanced picture between the positive and negative effects of agriculture on groundwater. And now we are moving. I think we are a little bit behind the schedule, so we are moving to the panel discussion. And I would like to hand over the floor to Mr. Abu Amani, who is my colleague and the director of the Division of Water Sciences and secretary of the Intergovernmental Hydrological Program of UNESCO. Abu will be the moderator of the panel. Abu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michela. Dear colleagues, after all this very excellent presentation on some of the elements of the report, as I highlighted that I was not able to see what was in the report, I'm really delighted to moderate the, I hope, interactive discussions, the panel discussions. And for this discussion, we have outstanding experts who have been contributing to the report, and I'm looking forward for an exciting interaction with them. But before that, I want to share with you two numbers regarding the ongoing campaign on the groundwater. The first number concerns the number of download and of all the products related to WWDR since its launch, as you know, in March during the 9th World Water Forum. We have now over 43,000 times download around the world concerning the report and its product. And also over 40 events were organized by UNESCO and its partners related to the popularization of the key messages regarding the report. And as you all know, the campaign will continue and it will culminate with the UN-Water Groundwater Summit, as was already alluded by the chair of UN-Water. The summit will be organized, as you know, here in Paris at UNESCO headquarters. And we're all inviting you to come to Paris. And our ambition is really to continue raising the profile of groundwater when it comes to water resource management, to have a comprehensive, integrated, conjunctive water management. And the messages which will come from the summit, our objective is to have those messages highlighted during the UN-2022 Water Conference. So let's now come to the conversation. As I said, we have 6 outstanding experts across various aspects of groundwater, including its management and governance. And for these interactive discussions, we will have some questions to the panelists, and each panelist will have 3 minutes, please 3 minutes to respond to the question. And then at the end, each panelist will have 1 minute for last word, depending of course on the time. But I believe that we'll be able to squeeze to keep the progress of the time. So without further ado, let me start with the first panelist, Seifou Kebede representing IAH. So Seifou, groundwater is an important resource for Africa, and given its huge potential, it's even called the silent giant. The silent giant is slowly being awakened to ensure water security across the continent. Can you share with us your views on good examples of sustainable use and development? And then what other opportunities are there in Africa? You have 3 minutes. Safe.
Thank you, Dr. Amani, for inviting me here and then for the question. Yes, Africa is sitting on, large groundwater resources compared to the other continents. It is untapped resource. And I think groundwater management starts from the acquiring sufficient knowledge, data, and information about the resources and its sustainability. So in that regard, Africa over the last 10 years has shown a steady growth in knowledge about our groundwater resources, thanks to mostly international collaboration with European and UK and US geological surveys and university cooperation, etc. And also because of national investments. For instance, if you look at countries like Ethiopia, Ethiopia has invested substantial amount of money on mapping shallow groundwater for irrigation. They use like 200,000 square kilometers for that. So this is just to say knowledge on Africa groundwater is steadily growing over the last 10 years. That is the key starting point for a good management, knowledge and information. Nevertheless, there are several examples here and there about a good management of groundwater. I can mention some example, for instance, use of groundwater for agro industries in countries like Ethiopia and Kenya for production of commercial, high value crops is one example. And then reaching out to people who are disenfranchised, pastoralists living in water scarce environments with drinking water. This is a good example of groundwater used for poverty reduction and reaching out to communities, and sustainable land management practices.
Just Sefu. I think we'll just say because of sake of time, we will continue. This is the issue related to online virtual events. I don't know if the technical people can assist. Otherwise, what I'm suggesting is to move to the next panelist. The next panelist is Neno Urik. Neno doesn't need any presentation from IGRAC. So Neno, a sound groundwater knowledge base is essential for efficient and sustainable decision making. When we talk about hydrometeorological data collection, we often say that there is a declining trend since the 80s. How is the situation with respect to groundwater monitoring?
Thank you, Abu, for your question. And it's a pity that we lost Seifu, but I will continue in his line and about importance of monitoring and assessment, importance of building up knowledge base. Concrete answer on your question, indeed, overall number of monitoring points is decreasing since 80s. We see that in the surface water monitoring, but then surface water monitoring has got compensation, a huge compensation from remote sensing. At the same time, remote sensing was useful for groundwater, but much less because it's underground and it's invisible. So in general, if you ask me what is the state of groundwater monitoring, do we know enough, sufficient on groundwater globally? Certainly no. Couple of years ago, IGREC, together with WMO and UNESCO, produced, and all our colleagues all over the world, produced a global overview of national groundwater monitoring programs. And there we see that, there are a lot of discrepancies among countries. Some countries have national programs, some don't. Some countries have information systems, some countries share data, some not. In general, IGREC produced, I remember already in 2004, a first inventory of groundwater monitoring in the world, but it was very limited. And we can say now that frequency of groundwater observations is more because of loggers, because of technology, and also there is more accessibility of the groundwater data increase due to information systems, but also due to duty of national services to report on taxpayer money. That's very important. And it is important to stress that all public groundwater monitoring data should be openly accessible, and also that the private companies should disclose relevant data information concerning subsurface water-related parameters. Maybe just to say that it's not only about monitoring, it's also about data processing, because we see a lot of countries collecting data, but not processing sufficiently. At the same time, there are some organizations and countries which are very creative how to process spatially spatial data, regional data, variability in space, which is very important for groundwater. And last but not least, capacity building. In many low and middle income countries, hydrological capacity is missing, even when groundwater makes a large part of their managed water resources. So those are the 3 points which I would like to make at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leno, for this insight, highlighting the critical importance of improving the knowledge base on groundwater and also all the related challenges, and particularly also making open the available data, because as you know, within UNESCO, we are promoting open science since the adoption of the UNESCO Open Science Resolution recommendation by UNESCO member state. So really that's what we are looking for that openness and accessibility of the data for decision making. So let's move to the next panelist, Eva Ma from IOM. So Eva, could you tell us about the link between migration, displacement, and groundwater resources? What are the major humanitarian and development concerns when considering this link and the future climate change scenarios? Over to you. 3 minutes, please, Eva.
Thank you very much, Abu, and many thanks to our colleagues in UNESCO for organizing this event, bringing us together, and of course, coordinating the World Water Development Report, which is a very important reference material for all of us. Until now, we really focused on the physical science related to groundwater resources, and now I would like to focus a little bit on one of the social aspects of climate change, which is migration, and look at the link with groundwater. There has been really a remarkable change in the past few years in terms of recognizing the link between migration and freshwater resources, especially considering climate change, as we have heard before. And while some context-specific research is available, these debates do not really differentiate between groundwater or surface water, so I will just cover freshwater in general. So on the one side of this discussion, we focused a lot on the ways lack of security, water security, drought as the most severe outcome of water scarcity, and desertification, for example, might drive migration or impact the decision to migrate. And although it's often difficult to isolate the water-related factors from other factors that influence the decision to migrate, most disaster displacements actually happen due to water-related weather events, either because there is too much water, in case of floods and storms, or because there is too little water, which is in the case of drought. And if we look at the latest predictions from UNCCD, IPCC, the World Bank, related to populations that are predicted to move because of climate change, many are actually linked to the hydrological cycle and the availability of freshwater resources. And we are talking about hundreds of millions of people. As an example, from UNCCD, 135 million people are at risk of being displaced because of desertification. The World Bank predicts that up to 216 million people are or could be forced to migrate by 2050. So we should really consider the migration and this water nexus beyond the humanitarian response, and also how to use groundwater resources efficiently in these contexts. And while we are talking about this from a risk perspective, we should also recognize that migration is an opportunity. It has been a long-standing adaptation strategy to deal with natural resource scarcity, especially seasonal natural resource scarcity. And we see communities around the world who have adopted to seasonal availability of water. We can think of the many nomadic pastoralist communities around the world. And we should also mention that the potential positive impact of migration on the environment and freshwater resources, including how seasonal or permanent migration patterns can actually lift the burden on the environment, and how diaspora communities can invest in their countries of origin through financial investments like remittances and diaspora bonds, but also through their own skills. Actually, many of us, many experts in the water sector are migrants themselves. And then just the third point is that the other side of this water migration discussion has been focusing on the impact of migration on water resources, especially the impact of large-scale displacement, including refugees and IDPs, internally displaced people, on freshwater resources. One of the most severe examples come from Jordan, the Syrian refugee influx into Jordan that really placed a huge strain on the freshwater resources in a country that is one of the most water stressed in the world. And really the issues are related to quantity. So this, more people are using the same amount of resources, so there is increased pressure on water sanitation and hygiene infrastructure. There's also the question of quality, which is about polluting groundwater aquifers, and access. Affordability is really at the heart of the debate when we talk about water security in this context. So more importantly for future planning, because migration is here to stay, we really need to look at these trends and understand how, for example, in case of unplanned urbanization, we can learn from these contexts and really adapt in a better manner also for climate change. So just to conclude, we should really consider how, for both humanitarian and development planning, we should address and prepare for climate migration, especially linked to freshwater resources, as I mentioned, it's a key factor to look at. Often groundwater resources remain invisible in fragile contexts. So again, everything our previous panelists have mentioned around data and research would be super important. And then, of course, look at how migration can be a potential adaptation strategy, especially in the face of climate change. And last but not least, how can we actually design better water management frameworks for displaced communities, for their hosts, to make sure that we ensure the human rights to water, as Pedro mentioned at the beginning of this session. So thank you very much again, UNESCO and all colleagues who brought us together.
Thank you very much, Eva, for highlighting that complex interlinkages of displacement, migration, and issue related to water, groundwater, climate change. Sure, yes, social aspect is critical, and we are looking forward to continue engaging with you on those issues. The next panelist is our colleague Lawrence from UNESCO, and he will address a question related to gender. So Lawrence, women are typically underrepresented in the water domain, and their presence is generally even lower for high-level management positions. What is the cause of this inequality, and what can be done to cover it? Over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Abu, for this question. And let me add that I'm very happy to form part of this panel. So just like Eva was saying previously, aside of considering, the usual physical aspects, it's also very crucial that we look into the social aspects. And indeed, it's clear that the water domain is male-dominated, and that in fact it is characterized by an underrepresentation of women within water-related jobs, but also decision-making at, well, virtually all levels and domains. And more precisely, data shows that women comprise less than 17% of the total paid workforce in the water sector. And this number, it's even lower when we consider high-level or management positions. So, well, with regards to the causes for this phenomenon, it's a direct result of governing socio-cultural values that are rooted deeply in society, and in turn give rise to these common beliefs on gender roles, which we also call stereotypes. And these stereotypes, they have quite substantial impact on women's role in the water sector. For instance, they can falsely dictate how jobs in a technical or engineering field are more suitable for men, whereas other fields like communication or social science would be, well, more suitable for women. And exactly because of this widespread and deeply rooted nature of these stereotypes, they're not easily eradicated, just like the associated gender inequalities are not. However, they lead women to face disparate constraints to obtain and even hold water-related jobs with respect to men. So what can be done to curb this problem? Sadly, there is no quick fix to this issue, although an array of diverse applicable solutions are known. And so I want to take the opportunity here to mention the multi-stakeholder call for action that the UNESCO World Water Assessment Program is facilitating in order to accelerate the achievement of gender equality in the water domain. And exactly this call for action initiative, it aims to raise awareness, to dismantle harmful gender stereotypes, to promote women's empowerment and leadership. And at the same time, it urges governments and financial institutions to commit concrete action and support to advancing gender equality in the water domain through diverse actions such as policy revisions, funding, or, for instance, the collection of gender disaggregated data. And well, these just mentioned are one-by-one examples of solutions to promote gender equality in the water domain.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Laurent, for highlighting this critical challenge. If really we want to solve the water issue, we have to address this issue of gender. It's a really critical issue. So let's move forward and mobilize, sensitize at any level so that really we can improve the contribution of women in addressing water challenges in the world. So let's move to the next panelist, Stefano Bucchi, Aida. Stefano, how are international customary laws evolving to address the issues that are specific to transboundary groundwater and aquifers? You have the floor. Stefano?
Thank you very much, Abu, and a pleasure to be in such good distinguished panel. Now, in answer to your question, in my opinion, the United Nations draft articles on the law of transboundary aquifers that have been prepared by the United Nations International Law Commission and that have been commended periodically since 2008 by the United Nations General Assembly to the attention of states, signal the highest point so far in the evolution of international customary law, precisely because the UN draft articles account for certain distinctive traits of aquifers and groundwater relative to rivers and lakes and surface water, such as notably the greater vulnerability of aquifers to pollution compared to rivers and lakes, the vulnerability of non-recharging of fossil aquifers to depletion and eventual exhaustion, and the complex natural recharge processes of groundwater and the equally complex natural discharge processes of groundwater feeding springs, wetlands, and oases. Now, the legal implications of the transboundary dimension of these aquifer and groundwater specific features are reflected in the draft articles through the obligations of states, a number of obligations of states that elaborate on and are more and are better targeted to groundwater than the general well-known reasonable and equitable utilization rule, the no significant harm rule, and the data and information exchange obligations that apply across all transboundary waters, be they surface or underground. Just to give you an example, for reasonable and equitable utilization purposes, when it comes to aquifers, groundwater, as reflected in the UN draft articles, states must maximize the long-term benefits of groundwater from groundwater exploitation and must not jeopardize the effective functioning of aquifers when utilizing them. In addition, the duty of no significant harm reaches out to the recharge zone of aquifers, regardless of the distance of such zone from the aquifer itself, and reaches out to the natural recharge and discharge processes. Now, this being said, to date, the United Nations draft articles on the law of transboundary aquifers and the more precise obligations that they carry for states are not legally binding on all nations, as the draft articles are not in the nature of a global international covenant or convention at this moment. Therefore, the uptake of the norms and the rules embedded in the draft articles is left to the goodwill of the states concerned when they negotiate an aquifer-specific treaty or agreement. In other words, they serve as guidance, inspiration. Nonetheless, they are quite credible and authoritative as a source of governance, all the same, as they emanate from a highly respected, authoritative international intergovernmental forum, which is the United Nations International Law Commission, and B, are based on the admittedly few treaties and agreements regarding groundwater and aquifers, and reflect, therefore, the actual practice of states in the matter. I think I will stop here for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for that, because we are running out of time. And also thank you for really highlighting the UN articles on transboundary aquifers as really the foundation and moving forward and addressing those transboundary groundwater laws in countries. So our last panelist, but not the least, is Jenny Gronholm from UNDP Water Governance Facility. So Jenny, how do you customary laws and legal laws interact with one another when it comes to rights to use groundwater? How is the situation of women and minority groups in the picture? Jenny?
Thank you so much, Abu, and thanks for inviting me. So your question about customary rules and legal laws and how they interact, it's one that relates to the rules of the game, as Eleanor Ostrom would have framed this type of institution. And of course, most countries have formal and statutory rules and regulations that cover groundwater resources management to a certain degree, at least. But then we also have in some countries, in much of Latin America and in Africa and in Asia, a legal framework existing in parallel with customary rules. And those tend to apply in a local setting or in a certain territory and apply, for instance, for an indigenous community. And those traditions and customs we're talking about here, they may cover the handling of land and water and other natural resources, but usually they are not codified. And such customary water rights and groundwater rights and also they tend to be intrinsically linked to land and embedded in land tenure system. And it's also interesting to note that communities that adhere to such customary rules, they may perceive groundwater resources as belonging to the community, something that is shared between everyone in this group, rather than being subject to individual water rights that form the basis of water rights where water is seen as owned by the state or by the people. And where such customary laws exist, the national law should ideally recognize that there is legal pluralism in this country and have a general rule for the acknowledgement of such. But of course, there are countries where customary law is ignored and where it can result in that community groundwater users, they are left without any legal protection compared with formal water rights holders, those with a permit or a concession in the same area. And when it comes to the situation then for women and minorities, so studies suggest that customary law can be traditional, conservative, gender segregated, and even discriminatory. They can give prominence to men and elders in those communities. So in decision-making processes, we would ideally want to promote good groundwater governance principles, including participation. And in relation to groundwater resources, these customary water rights may then be against the interests of women and children and minorities. So for instance, when these groups are denied formal land ownership, they may also be deprived of groundwater rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for highlighting these complex interlinkages, and particularly on the right and also for the minority groups. Now we have only officially 2 minutes left. So what I'm suggesting, I know that we can have maybe 2-3 minutes before we are cut off. I will ask Seifu if he's back to. We're sorry, Seifu, for the technicality.
Yes, I'm back.
Yeah, if you could, 1 minute, if you could summarize. Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you so much. I was mentioning about examples from Africa of good groundwater management. There are a number of them, but not enough. And nevertheless, just to conclude my talk, my intervention, one of the figures presented by FAO, calling from FAO, was very striking. You know, the groundwater used for irrigation, food production in Africa, nearly 0%. And then for Africa to move from that 0% to a larger share in that pie is going to take very short time. So to move from no use to large abstraction, it takes very little time. So Africa must use last movers advantage to govern its groundwater resources and monitor it, and then make use of it for its socio-economic transformation. Thank you so much, Dr. Amani.
Thank you, Seifu, and apologies once again for the hiccup. So we have only 1 minute left. So what I'm suggesting, normally we're supposed to have 1 minute round panel statement from the panelists. Unfortunately, it will not be possible. So I'm suggesting if you could send to us your statement so that they can be compiled within the report of the session. And I would like to thank all of you for your great contribution to this discussion, and also to acknowledge the participation of our UN agencies and other partners, the UN Habitat, FAO, IAH, and other members of the and partners of UN-WWDR, and particularly for the great contribution to the profession of WWDR2022 on groundwater making the invisible visible. And we are looking forward to see all of you in Paris, as I said, during the UN-WWDR Groundwater Summit. So now I want to ask my colleague, Michaela, to take over. Michaela, was it closing?
Thank you, Abu, for your great moderation. Okay, we are at the closure. So we have said that groundwater is and will be our most important resource in the year to come. On the same time, we actually see growing vulnerabilities stemming from overexploitation and pollution, quantity and quality of groundwater. For this reason, the 2022 edition of the report underlines the benefit of timely actions for sustainable management of groundwater. Another priority is to bring groundwater issues higher up on the political agenda to secure commitments. The UN Groundwater Summit that UNESCO is organizing in December, as Abu was saying, follow this thinking, and we invite you to participate and with your contributions and get involved. Before closing the session, I would like to share with you the latest news on the 2023 UN World Water Development Report. In fact, we at WAP with all the UN Water members and partners are already working on the new edition, whose topic is accelerating change through partnership and cooperation. So I invite all participants to get prepared and involved in the preparation of the World Water Day campaign regarding this topic organized by UN Water for the next March 2023. With this, I conclude my words, and I thank you, the speakers, the panelists, for their rich contributions. A special thanks goes to my colleague Engin Kontagul for organizing this session, and all of you for joining us. Have a nice World Water Week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you and bye.
Well done. Great job.
Bye.
Thank you all.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a pleasant day.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.